We're getting to the sad one now. Destruction of the Lamenters. Inquisitor Legate Jardice Frayne provided the Loyalists with a mass of data about the Lamenters' movements and deployments, which was used to identify a pattern. By 908, the Lamenters chapter had already suffered significant losses through attrition, but they were still a formidable force to be reckoned with, and the plan was put into action to isolate them from the tyrant's cause and take them out of the war. Using the intelligence acquired by Frayne's insidious spy network, the Loyalists quickly discerned that the Lamenters were being used as an ablative shield by the Tyrant of Badab to guard his southern flank and contest the Loyalist domination of the Pale Stars, while he kept the bulk of the Astral Claws in reserve near Badab itself. The loss incurred by the fleet-based chapter had been due to their continuous deployment defending the southern Badab sector, as well as serving escort duty to many successionist supply convoys. The Minotaur's chapter gathered in strength, awaiting the opportunity to strike where they would be most effective, until finally the opportunity came, when the location of the Lamenter's chapter baroque, Mater Lacrimarum, was discovered in orbit over the feral world of Optera, taking on supplies. I like that name, Mater Lacrimarum. Well, anyway, continuing the story. The Minotaurs immediately dispatched a rapid strike force to attack the vessel and succeed in catching it and crippling its main drives, preventing it from fleeing the system. The Lamenters were forced to defend their chapter baroque at all costs, as it contained both their recovering battle casualties as well as their precious resource of gene seed. With the continued attacks upon the baroque, the majority of the Lamenters' fleet was drawn back to the Optera system. Once there, the Minotaurs laid bloody siege for 17 solar hours of brutal ship-to-ship fighting. Though the Minotaurs suffered heavy casualties, they eventually overpowered the Lamenters by virtue of their brutality and sheer weight of numbers. Their forces shattered. The few remaining Lamenters were forced to surrender rather than risk the annihilation of their precious baroque. The majority of their fleet was left unruined or drifting in the void. The Minotaurs claimed salvage rights to the crippled Lamenters' fleet and the war gear of the fallen to replace their own serious losses. The surviving Lamenters were incarcerated on a prison hulk orbiting the night side of Sagan II, amid rumors of their growing insanity and confinement. Only 311 Lamenters battle brothers survived to be interned on the prison hulk orbiting Sagan II for the rest of the war. Less than 100, estimated of course, Lamenters were deployed elsewhere during the fighting that still remained. The chapter's severe losses effectively removed them from the Successionists' order of battle. The loss of the Lamenters from the Successionist cause was a great strength they could ill afford to lose. Angstrom Incident. Wait, it's not I don't think it's Maelstrom, I think it's Maelstrom. But I think Maelstrom sounds better. Anyway, the Maelstrom Incident. The Loyalists intervened in matters unfolding on the world of Angstrom in 908, in what would become one of the most remarkable operations of the Badab War. The sovereign and autonomous Adeptus Mechanicus domain of Angstrom in the eastern Maelstrom Zone had remained neutral throughout the conflict, rejecting diplomatic missions and threats from both sides to join them in their cause. The world's Magi felt that there was no cause for them to interfere in what they perceived as an internal dispute between rival Imperial factions. Angstrom continued their operations as usual, which included a long-standing agreement to render up bounty of advanced weapons and refined ores to be collected by the Imperium's representatives on a 3-year cycle from the edge of their planetary system. The Magi pointedly didn't care from which of the Imperium servants retrieved the bounty, only that they carried out their part of the arrangement without fault. In the past, this arrangement had provided the Maelstrom warders with vital resources, and the Tyrant of Badab's servants continued to be in the perfect position to collect it. The Red Scorpions and Salamanders jointly conducted a secret plan of attack, deploying a small elite force to sabotage and prevent the Successionists from claiming the bounty of the independent forge world of Angstrom. And the confusion and destruction that followed, the Angstrom Mechanicus, incensed by the outbreak of hostilities within their domain, assaulted both sides and drove them away from the system, granting the Loyalists a major strategic victory. But did, however, steer the notorious Bellicos Mechanicus of Angstrom into taking a greater interest in the war. They sent their warships and ground forces in retaliatory raids against Galan and Ibis, until the Terran legate intervened and brokered a peace, guaranteeing the fickle Angstrom Mechanicus restitution. Remaining cautious, Lord High Commander Karba Colin took precautionary measures and dispatched the Firehawks chapter and the Raptorus Rex alongside the pursuit force, composed of a mixture of loyalist chapters, to conduct a blockade on the outer system's approach for the duration of the war. Loyalist domination. 909. By 909 of the 31st millennium, of course, the Imperial Loyalists had effective command on the Maelstrom Zones, major warp routes, enabling them to rapidly move their forces across the region and subjugate many rebel worlds and outposts. The Angstrom incident's aftermath effectively cut the Tyrant of Badab's sphere of influence in half and contained the succession, dividing the successionists between the Endymion cluster and the Badab sector itself. Only the unpredictable forces of the Executioner's chapter offered a significant threat to the Loyalist control outside the Successionist enclaves. From this point onwards, the Successionists, greatly reduced in fighting strength and warships, were effectively hemmed in around a handful of heavily defended star clusters and relegated to conducting scattered raiding operations and fighting a series of close defensive sieges. By the end of 909, whispers had reached Imperial intelligence operatives of the tyrant's increasing violence and paranoia, and of the further tightening of his murderous stranglehold on those worlds he still controlled. The Mantis warriors were reduced to fighting a guerrilla resistance against an ongoing loyalist suppression campaign, comprising combined elements from the Fire Angels and the Sons of Medusa chapters. Sporadic and oft-times bloody engagements were also fought in the Tranquility, Iblis, and Sigurd systems. The Loyalist forces suffered a severe defeat when the Fire Angel strike cruiser, Polaris Rising, was raided by the Mantis warriors under the leadership of their prophetic Master Librarian, Ahazara Redth. That's a weird name, but it's bound to happen in the 40k universe. They succeeded in damaging their main plasma reactors and weapon bays before withdrawing their forces, leaving them at the mercy of two Orc Killa cruisers. The Fire Angels fought a resolute last stand against the vile Greenskins, disabling one of the Killa cruisers before they were boarded by the remaining Orc vessel. As the Orcs swarmed the decks of the Fire Angels vessel, and the Mantis warriors fell in ambush upon the badly mauled Orc forces from their flank and annihilated them. The remaining 37 surviving Fire Angels were marooned to Sigurd VI under the care of their surviving apothecary and his servitors, while their battered vessel was taken by the Mantis warriors as their prize. The barbarous Executioner's chapter continued to prove to be the scourge of Loyalist patrols and supply convoys, as well as destroying numerous outposts and listening stations. Some 43 merchantmen. Why is it spelled together? Whatever. Some 43 merchantmen and 11 warships have been either seized or destroyed. They also committed themselves to several heavy raids as far as Bellerophon's Fall and Cairo. Their heaviest action fell against the savage Minotaur's chapter in the southern Maelstrom Zone, such as the bloody tank duo fought on the airless moon of Uzil, and the Crow World system. The location of the Executioner's base of operations continued to elude the Loyalists, allowing the Executioners to raid them almost at will, giving battle against Red Scorpions and Minotaur chapters, harrying Loyalist shipping and stemming attempts to consolidate Loyalist gains. At the close of 909, of course, of the 31st millennium, the Maelstrom succession had largely been contained, but the war itself was far from over. The Loyalists knew that the next phase of the campaign would be particularly brutal. It would be a time of ruthless planetary purges, scorched earth campaigns, not tactics, and apocalyptic sieges. The Loyalists needed time to prepare for such a campaign, and fresh reinforcements if a victory was to be swiftly achieved. But Lord High Commander Caravan Call, the Magister Militum of the Adeptus Astartes forces, and his advisors knew they could not afford to wait too long before they went on the offensive, for every day gave the successionists further opportunity to entrench and perhaps make good their own losses. Cullen knew he simply could not afford to allow a general of Huron's caliber too long to rebuild, plan, and prepare. Subjugation of Galen. The beginning of the year 910, of the 31st millennium, of course, proved to be a final deathly calm before the oncoming storm, which would inevitably see the Badab War brought to its terrible conclusion. Many of the chapters on the Loyalist side had suffered substantial losses, and now would be replaced by other Space Marine chapters of even darker renown. The Maelstrom Zone would soon be visited by slaughter unlike anything it had known in its long and turbulent history. For 6 long standard years, the isolated Galen system had been a prize that had been battled over repeatedly, changing hands between Loyalist and Successionist forces several times. Most significantly, the Galen system had been the site of major battles between the Firehawks chapter and the mixed Successionist assault force, which had incurred heavy losses on both sides. A battle which had seen Galen 2's or Galen 2's life-supporting domes laid waste, leading to mass refugee immigration to its neighbor, the frontier world of Galen 6. Under the direct command of the Magister Militum, Caravan Coln, the Loyalist forces diverted to impose order on Galen 6, crushing any hope of future resistance utterly. Accompanied by an Ordo Hereticus detachment under Inquisitor Cramner, one of Inquisitor Legate Jarndyce Freyne's personal aides, the only stipulation was that the planet was to remain habitable within a sufficient core of the population and infrastructure left alive and intact to service the needs of the Imperium's war effort. Plans to retake the world were calculated accordingly, under the direction of the Sons of Medusa's chapters, Irantane Vailud Kal, the theater commander. The Sons of Medusa launched an orbital bombardment of predetermined landing zones on the outskirts of the old city. They then claimed 3 company-strength landing zones on the edge of Galen 6's old city, encircling it and destroying all resistance. Over the course of 3 solar days and nights, the industrious Sons of Medusa landed supplies in additional Astartes and began the task of fabricating new fortifications and bastions. On the dawning of the 4th day, an unnatural fear and dread had descended upon the several million surviving inhabitants. This fear was a calculated weapon of the often employed by the Sons of Medusa. Without warning, the chapter launched a large armored assault composed of rhinos, razorbacks, land raiders, and hulking dreadnoughts, while land speeders took to the skies. Alongside the green livery of the emerald armored specters of death was the crimson colors of the Inquisition's chimeras and repressors. From their vehicles' laud hailers, the Inquisition demanded the surrender of all of Gallon 6's population for immediate judgment. Some of the population hurled themselves suicidally at the embodiment of the Emperor's wrath, only to be ruthlessly cut down by the Sons of Medusa, while others cowered in their hastily prepared defensive positions or attempted to flee the city. Those that attempted to do so were ruthlessly cut down by the patrolling land speeders and vulture gunships. Those that offered serious resistance within the city were isolated and destroyed. Only those that offered no resistance were spared, ignored by the Sons of Medusa as they had been so ordered. These survivors wept openly, joyful only to be taken by the Inquisition's troops for processing and judgment on the Holy Ordos' assize bastions located in the Imperial landing zones. The old city was firmly in the hands of the Imperials within 76 solar hours of the commencement of the Sons of Medusa's attack. News of the massacre soon spread across Gallon 6, and the shroud of terror descended upon the planet. Before long, millions of natives and refugees alike surrendered, even though to do so was believed to be a death sentence at the hands of the Inquisition, rather than live in fear of what was to come. The ruins of the old city were repurposed and rebuilt as an interment and processing center to handle Gallon 6's population. Overall, the Gallon campaign was considered a success, although much of the population of Old City had been slain. The total death toll was considered light compared to that of a lengthy, planet-wide campaign of attrition. Amazingly, the Ordo Hereticus was merciful, indentering the majority of the planet's population into a lifetime of penal servitude to pay for their crimes and transgressions against the Emperor. As a result, the Departamento Monitorum raised a number of fresh penile legions from the most hardened elements found on the world, while the rest of the population was set to toil on Gallon 6 itself or be deported elsewhere within the Maelstrom Zone to aid the rebuilding effort. The Sons of Medusa departing Gallon 6 shortly thereafter, leaving the planet as a veritable prison world whose population would pay for their crimes against the Imperium for generations. Are you ready for this one? Blood in the Dark Waters, 910. Arriving without warning in 910, an unidentified, fire-blackened Space Marine strike cruiser identified itself with an ancient, though still valid, Imperial authorization protocols. It was the Levitus Vex, and its coming heralded the arrival of a force whose name was to become synonymous with bloodshed and the darkest acts of the Badab War. The unified Space Marine force had come to offer its aid to the Loyalist cause against the Secessionists, claiming to have come in answer to a summon from Terra itself. They identified their chapter as the Carcadons Astar, using the ancient High Gothic form of their name, also known as the Carcadons, or the Space Sharks, in Low Gothic, and formally requested the Loyalist acceptance and permission to enter the war zone and draw blood. Upon their arrival, the Carcadons, Force Commander Tiberius, presented the Inquisitor Legate in charge of prosecuting the Badab conflict with notices patent provided to the chapter, affirming the rights and titles issued to it by several High Lords of Terra and Inquisitors now long dead. Tiberius even submitted himself for psychic probing and gene sampling. The Inquisitor Legate vouched for the Carcadons. Lord High Commander Karab Cullen of the Red Scorpions, the Magister Militant or Supreme Commander of all Loyalist forces, accepted the Carcadons into his lines of battle, although he was still wary of their loyalties and their deviations from the Codex Astartes during their long voyage beyond Imperial space. The Carcadons' reappearance as if predators drawn by blood when the Badab War was to enter its most deadly stage seemed to many a suspect one at best. The Tranquility Campaign, 910. By 910, the strength of the Mantis warriors had been greatly diminished, but Karab Kolum recognized the folly of leaving them undefeated at his flank as the Loyalists turned their force to the invasion of the Badab sector. The Adeptus Astartes Magister Militum had already considered a change in his deployment in order to mount a renewed offensive against the Endymion cluster. But with the arrival of the Carcadons, the Lord High Commander of the Red Scorpions had been offered an unexpected asset to deploy. And so, he let loose their savage ferocity against the Mantis warriors and the unsuspecting worlds of their domain. The fleet of the Carcadons broke out of warp directly above the Sigard system, on the galactic plane, perilously close to Sigard's swollen and violent sun, masking their presence with its solar flares. Split up in dozens of strike forces, the grey-clad Space Marines led the Sigard system have the first taste of their wrath and fury as they proceeded to devastate the numerous belt colonies, ship clans, and asteroid citadels. The Carcadons proceeded to devastate the entirety of the system, destroying in mere solar days and weeks what had taken millennia to build and had withstood the ravages of Xenos and Corsairs alike. In the aftermath of this brutal campaign, an Imperial naval scout vessel reported the entire system littered with wreckage, their Vox channels full of discordant, ghostly Vox signals of dead and dying ships. It was also noted that the Carcadons had deliberately plundered and scavenged, both in terms of gear, resource, and indeed human life. It had been the conclusion of several authorities since that the choice of Sigard, with its wealth of void colonies and infrastructure, had been the Carcadons' first target, not simply because it had long connections with the Mantis warriors, but because the Carcadons' unknown voyage from the outer darkness they had need of its bounty to replenish themselves in readiness for their part in the war. The Carcadons continued to systematically annihilate planets in the cluster known to have harbored the Mantis warriors, forcing the Successionist Chapter to stop using their hidden run tactics against the Loyalists and mass their forces in defense of these worlds. The strategy spared the Carcadons from having to pursue them across the Endymion cluster to places where their foes held the advantage of support and local knowledge. First, the Carcadons ravaged the feudal world of Iblis, smashing its infrastructure and putting its ruler to the sword. Then, they attacked the planet's scattered settlements and nomadic crawler caravans by night, leaving bloody wreckage in their wake. They proceeded to turn Iblis into a wasteland inhabited only by shell-shocked survivors. The savage chapter then moved on and attacked the blighted industrial world of Endymion Prime itself, where a small Fire Angels force already held command of a decrepit Manufactoria complex against Mantis warriors-led insurgents. The Carcadons launched an orbital assault, oblivious to the Fire Angels' disposition, into the contested battle. Hundreds of great drop pods dropping to the soot-caked planet amid a great slaughter. Honor-bound to defend this world, the Mantis warriors were forced to respond, coming to Endymion Prime's aid with increasing numbers of their chapter to curb the savagery of the Carcadons' assault. Though the Mantis warriors matched the Carcadons with their own fierce and martial skill, they were too few and could not turn the tide of the assault. Led by their chief librarian Ahazra Redis, the Mantis warriors refused to retreat and died in defense of the planet, just as the Carcadons' leader Tiberos had predicted. The Carcadons continued to employ this pattern on the worlds of Castal and Largitor, and then the twin inhabited worlds of the Tranquility system themselves. Each battle forced the Mantis warriors to come to the aid of the beleaguered worlds, destroying the Mantis warriors' ability to effect the war. Now, worn down and scattered, the chapter had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force, but at a great price. In the aftermath of the Tranquility Campaign, the Fire Angels, having suffered heavy casualties, sought permission to withdraw from the conflict. This was in no small part due to the increasing anger of the Fire Angels against the Carcadons, with whom they had repeatedly been at odds during the Tranquility Campaign, and whose savage metas they held in utter contempt. Appalled by the actions of their allies, the Fire Angels withdrew their remaining contingents from the war with honor and returned to their homeworld to rebuild their sorely damaged chapter. With the threat of the Endymion cluster neutralized, the Carcadons redeployed, splitting their fleets to patrol the Loyalists' rear echelons and relive the Minotaurs and Red Scorpions to consolidate ahead of the expected invasion of the Badab sector. Unfortunately for the ravished people of the Endymion cluster, this would not be the only time calamity was visited upon their worlds, for the Carcadons would yet return in later years to enact a final act of savagery against them. Corsian Massacre. This is considered by some as a lost tale. And it's a lost tale of the Badab War, whose true facts will never be known. The event that became known in Imperial records as the Corsinian Massacre was discovered by an Imperial Navy patrol in 910. The wreckage of a smuggler's base was discovered in the dust waste of the forlorn world of Corsia II. Within the base was a nightmarish scene of carnage and destruction, rarely witnessed before by men. Bloody battle had been fought between two sub-company-sized forces of Space Marines from the Executioners and the Carcadons chapters. These two chapters, both infamous for their savagery and unyielding stances toward their foes, had fought each other to mutual annihilation. The base around them was ripped apart, its former inhabitants now moldering into dust. Many of the bodies of both sides showed signs of having fought on despite suffering horrendous wounds, severed limbs, and massive trauma that would have felled even an Astartes. And several were found locked in deathly gore-splattered embraces, striking at their foes with their last ebbing strength. It is not known which chapter last warrior survived to the end to claim a bitter victory. Neither chapter has acknowledged any survivors of the massacre living to tell of what happened at Corsia II. Clash of Iron and Fire, 910. In mid-910, there was an increase in Corsair activity along the eastern Maelstrom Zone. Among those in the Loyalist High Command, this was believed to have been caused by at least one Astral Claws task force that had somehow slipped out of the Badab sector itself and was now operating from the edges of the Maelstrom. Imperial Navy escorts, search and destroy squadrons were dispatched to the area to quell these attacks so that the Successionists would not be able to exploit the opportunity to start a new battlefront on the Loyalist flank. Upon the frontier world of Rook, they found their evidence. This was one of the few worlds within the Maelstrom that could be relied upon to willingly aid Imperial agents, as their population was made up of obolitionist zealots. They informed the Loyalist command that there had indeed been an increase in slave raids of nearby systems of human corsair ships led by an Astral Claw strike cruiser, identified as the Hikrania. The pattern of attacks by these corsair ships was tracked by the echo left in the warp to the Lamptan system and its twin feral worlds of Shaprias and Scarfell. Having divined that a strong enemy force was massing at this location, the Imperial Navy squadron was forced to withdraw in order to refit and resupply, returning to seek reinforcements. Elsewhere in the northern Maelstrom Zone, the Carcadons were busy carrying out the final stages of the Tranquility Campaign, while in the southern zone, the Minotaurs and Sons of Medusa, backed by Astra Militarum Pino regiments, were assaulting Isin on the edge of the Badab sector itself, where the Tyrant's Legion was putting up a tenacious defense. Lord High Commander Calab Cullen marched his own Red Scorpions chapter and the newly reinforced Exorcist chapter contingent at Sagan in preparation for an assault on the strategic warp terminus of Piraeus. This was a vital target and considered by many to be the gateway to the Badab sector. Overall, the Loyalist forces had suffered considerable losses since the start of the war, and the contingents of many of the Space Marine chapters which had previously fought for the Loyalists' cause had now departed. Some, such as the Howling Griffins and Marines Errant, had withdrawn owing to the casualties they had suffered, while others, such as the Nova Marines and the most recently Fire Angels, had departed for reasons of their own. In short, Loyalist forces were stretched thin, despite the fresher Space Marine companies that had recently arrived, and Cullen could not afford to be drawn into fighting on an increasing number of fronts to be bled dry slowly by attrition, as no doubt was the Tyrant of Badab's plan. Taking counsel with his fellow Space Marine commanders, it was the leader of the Salamander's contingent, the old and famed warrior Pelas Mirsan, who offered a solution to the events of Lapton, offering to lead his own forces in a lightning strike against Lapton. The Salamanders would rely on the element of surprise, the arcane skills of Ona Nostroma, to position their attack, and the power of their potent battle barge, Pyre of Glory, dealing a crippling blow to the enemy. Chaplain Ivanus Enkomi, representing the aloof and secretive Minotaurs chapter in the War Council, offered to take his personal guard and such forces as he could muster to aid the Salamanders in this mission. So, approved, the strike force named the Gift of Fire was further augmented by a pair of Imperial Navy light cruisers and a frigate squadron. This force was dispatched immediately on the long voyage to the Laptan system. They were to meet the foe in battle.